So what exactly did this tree spiking involve? Well, it involved spikes like these. Spikes made of steel that, when placed into a tree, can cause widespread damage to those harvesting the trees, those milling the trees. They've maimed many and wounded many others as a result of radical environmentalists taking this tactic to try to stop the harvesting of timber on federal lands. Now, regardless of how you may feel about timber harvesting policy on federal lands, I think all Americans of good faith and conscience can agree that it's not a good idea to use terrorism to advance your goals.
People could get hurt. Why didn't you just contact the FBI or anybody, any local authority?
Because the person who did this act threatened people's lives if they disclosed who did it.
Yeah, in fact, you were investigated for being involved, weren't you? Here we have a letter sent to this committee from the special agent of the USDA Forest Service, Michael Merkley, who was in charge of the investigation. He says, and he details this in the letter to this committee, that he investigated you for your involvement. He says, and I'm going to quote now, grand jury subpoenas were issued for hair samples, handwriting exemplars, fingerprints. These subpoenas were served on persons suspected of being involved, having knowledge of the incident, including Ms. Tracy Stone Manning. You've testified you were never investigated ever for anything. Why'd you lie to this committee?
Senator, this committee delved deeply, went into the court records where I testified against these men.
Were you issued subpoenas?
Madam President, in 1989, Tracy Stone Manning rented a typewriter to draft and then send a letter threatening those who might choose to harvest trees. The letter stated that the trees in question had been sabotaged with hundreds of pounds of spikes. She closed the letter with, quote, "You bastards go in there anyway," meaning notwithstanding her threat. And a lot of people could get hurt, close quote. She and her cohorts thus used the threat of physical violence to achieve a political goal. This is the definition of terrorism. In 1993, multiple associates of Ms. Stone Manning were convicted of tree spiking by a federal jury. Though she signed and swore that the information provided to the committee was, to the best of her knowledge and belief, current, accurate, and complete, Ms. Stone Manning told the Energy and Natural Resources Committee that she had never been investigated. This was, in fact, not true. It was widely reported that in 1990, Ms. Stone Manning was required to give hair samples, a full set of fingerprints, and writing samples. This was already a year after she had conspired with her circle of friends, members of the radical environmentalist group Earth First. She was still not cooperating with the authorities. Now, how do we know that she was, in fact, a target of the investigation and not simply a bystander? Well, we know that based on a letter from Michael Merkley, a retired special agent criminal investigator for the Forest Service. He writes the following, quote, "The witness described how Ms. Stone Manning typed and mailed the letter to the Forest Service. She also recounted a conversation she had overheard wherein Ms. Stone Manning, along with her other co-conspirators, planned the tree spiking and discussed whether to use ceramic or metal spikes in the trees. As a result of the witness's testimony, the grand jury sent Ms. Stone Manning a target letter, which meant she was going to be indicted on criminal charges for her active participation in planning these crimes. She hired an attorney who negotiated a deal with an assistant United States attorney to gain immunity in exchange for her testimony against the other defendants," close quote. Now, Ms. Stone Manning did not gain immunity simply for being a good person or a model citizen. No, she traded her knowledge after withholding it for years. This is verified by her own admission in the May 21st, 1993 edition of the Missoulian, reading, quote, "Stone Manning said she could have been charged with conspiracy were it not for the agreement she reached with the U.S. attorney," close quote. Furthermore, she received a target letter, meaning she knew very well that she had been under investigation. This is a direct contradiction of the sworn statement that she made to the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, on which I serve. So she deliberately misled U.S. senators. Unfortunately, Ms. Stone Manning has been able to deceive a lot of people. Even a White House official acknowledged that this was a massive vetting failure. So what exactly did this tree spiking involve? Well, it involved spikes like these. Spikes made of steel that, when placed into a tree, can cause widespread damage to those harvesting the trees, those milling the trees. They've maimed many and wounded many others as a result of radical environmentalists taking this tactic to try to stop the harvesting of timber on federal lands. Now, regardless of how you may feel about timber harvesting policy on federal lands, I think all Americans of good faith and conscience can agree that it's not a good idea to use terrorism to advance your goals. It's not a good idea to use threats of physical violence and present people with a real, foreseeable, and in fact foreseen and intended risk that they will be harmed or could even die as a result of the 500 pounds of these tree spikes that they placed in the trees in question. So, yeah, the White House admitted that this was a vetting failure, and a vetting failure it was. It was either a vetting failure or no one at the administration cared when Tracy Stone Manning tweeted out only months ago an article written by her husband, an article that itself states, quote, "There's a rude and satisfying justice in burning down the house of someone who builds in the forest," close quote. When she tweeted out this story, apparently with her approval, she called it a clarion call, her words, not mine, seeming almost to celebrate their misfortune, to revel in the misery and loss of those who had just had their homes destroyed, oftentimes as a result of chronic mismanagement on federal lands, allowing fuel to build up and remain untreated. There are plenty of homes in forests in Utah. I presume that there are plenty of homes elsewhere. There are plenty of homes in Arizona, Montana, California, Colorado, Nevada, West Virginia, and elsewhere. So I'd ask the question, how can we entrust the responsibility to protect the homes of those Americans who live on or near a forest from forest fire to an individual who actively advocated only months ago for their demise, who apparently celebrated their demise? Lastly, and perhaps most heinously, revelations have also come out regarding research she conducted for her thesis. In 1992, Tracy Stone Manning published her graduate student thesis at the University of Montana, entitled "Into the Heart of the Beast, A Case for Environmental Advertising," which espoused several radical views on population and grazing. In this thesis, she published a photo of a child with the caption, this photo with this caption right here. It says, it's got a picture of a young child, a toddler. Can you find the environmental hazard in this photo? She then indicated that the child, this baby, was the environmental hazard. She then elaborates, quote, "Americans believe that overpopulation is only a problem somewhere else in the world, but it's a problem here too. We breed more than any other industrialized nation. At the same time, we suck up 1/3 of the world's energy. When we overpopulate, the Earth notices it more. Stop at 2. It could be the best thing you do for the planet. Do the truly smart thing. Stop at 1 or 2 kids." This is a fringe belief. It's a dangerous belief. Not only is it factually flawed, but it's morally repugnant. As a father of 3, I'm repulsed, ashamed, and saddened. As much as anything, as the resident of a state, 2/3 of which is owned by the federal government, 40% of which is under the direct management and control of the Bureau of Land Management, the entity that she's been nominated to head. I'm mortified that she's going to be in charge of all that land, because this is how she views human beings. We should all accept the fact that human beings are assets, they're blessings. They're not liabilities. Children are beautiful gifts from heaven above, not environmental hazards. I've consistently voiced outrage at China's one-child policy, and we're here today voting on a nominee who calls for similar action, telling parents in the most condescending tone imaginable, quote, stop at 1 or 2 kids. Because according to Ms. Stone Manning, we're simply breeding too much. So now we must ask ourselves, will this body advance the nomination of a person who played a central role in endangering the lives of foresters and sawmillers, engaging in acts of reckless, deliberately harmful environmental terrorism using 500 pounds of tree spikes, and who attempted to deceive members of the United States Senate about these same violent actions, has advocated for homes to be left to burn in the wilderness, indicating that she would celebrate when that happened, and called children an environmental hazard? The director of the Bureau of Land Management, the position that Ms. Stone Manning has been nominated to fill, has immense discretionary power. This isn't simply a matter that's concerning for symbolic reasons. It is that too, but far more than that. If confirmed to this position, she's going to have immense discretionary power. Could we rest knowing that she was at the helm of the Bureau of Land Management, making decisions about grazing, wildfire response, wildfire prevention, suppression, and rehabilitation, and everything else that the Bureau of Land Management is charged with? I could not, I cannot, and I will not. And so I urge my colleagues to reject her nomination. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start, Mr. Chairman, I want to say thank you for your strong statement on the RICA legislation yesterday and for your leadership on this issue. It's much, much appreciated. Director Stone Manning, let me just start with this. When you came before this committee in 2021, this is before I was a member of the committee, you were asked as part of your confirmation whether you'd ever been investigated, arrested, charged by any federal, state, or local law enforcement authority for the violation of any federal, state, or local law, regulation, or ordinance other than a minor traffic offense. We asked that question of all people before the committee. You answered no. Do you stand by that testimony?
Senator, I do stand by that testimony and was proud to be confirmed to do this job.
What's tree spiking, Director?
Senator, again, this committee engaged quite a bit in
No, that's a factual question. Do you know what it is?
And I do. It is.
Do you want to tell us? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's when people illegally put metal objects into trees so that they prevent a timber sale.
What happens if a chainsaw hits a spike?
Sometimes when a chainsaw hits a spike, it can buck the saw.
Yeah, violently recoil, potentially kill or seriously maim the loggers.
Yeah, which is why I notified the federal authorities that I had heard that had happened.
Loggers like, for instance, George Alexander, this is from an article on the Washington Post explaining what happens when trees get spiked. Loggers who are blue-collar workers, by the way, these are not wealthy people. These are not people who have had the advantages perhaps you and others have had. People like George Alexander, who, for example, in May 1987, at age 23, his chainsaw hit a tree spike. I'm quoting, his face was slashed from eye to chin, his teeth were smashed, his jaw was cut in half. That's a typical reaction when a logger hits a spike. Now, you just said, I think just a second ago, that you were involved. There were 2 people convicted in 1989 of putting 500 pounds of spikes in an Idaho forest. Senator Rich mentioned this just a moment ago. You testified you sent a letter to the Forest Service on their behalf. I have it here. The letter says, among other things, this letter sent to notify you that the post office sale, that's the forest sale in Idaho, has been spiked heavily. The reason for this action is that this piece of land is very special to the earth. It is home to the elk, deer, mountain lions, birds, and especially the trees. It goes on, I would be more than willing to pay you $1 for the sale, but you'd have to find me first, and that could be your worst nightmare. P.S. You bastards go in there anyway, and a lot of people could get hurt. Why'd you send this?
Senator, as I said at the time, over 30 years ago, a really angry and turns out violent person handed me that letter and said, will you send this to the Forest Service?
And you did. Why?
What you just talked about in 1987 to a logger, this is 1988, 9. I understood that people could get hurt.
Why didn't you notify the federal authorities? Why did you send this threatening letter on behalf of these two men who were convicted of crimes?
I was terrified of them and wanted no involvement with them.
So you wanted no involvement, but you sent a letter that says, you bastards go in there anyway, and a lot of people could get hurt? Why didn't you just contact the FBI or anybody, any local authority?
Because the person who did this act threatened people's lives if they disclosed who did it.
Yeah, in fact, you were investigated for being involved, weren't you? Here we have a letter sent to this committee from the special agent of the USDA Forest Service, Michael Merkley, who was in charge of the investigation. He says, and he details this in the letter to this committee, that he investigated you for your involvement. He says, and I'm going to quote now, grand jury subpoenas were issued for hair samples, handwriting exemplars, fingerprints. These subpoenas were served on persons suspected of being involved, having knowledge of the incident, including Ms. Tracy Stone Manning. You've testified you were never investigated, ever for anything. Why did you lie to this committee?
Senator, this committee delved deeply, went into the court records where I testified against these men.
Were you issued subpoenas?
No.
You were not issued subpoenas?
I was issued a subpoena to appear before a grand jury with
Really?
with
Because
about 13
here's what he
people.
says. Ms. Stone Manning was extremely difficult to work with. She was antagonistic. She was uncooperative, refused to provide her hair, handwriting exemplars, and fingerprints as ordered by the grand jury. It was not until after we informed her she would be arrested if she did not comply with the subpoenas that she provided the samples to me. So you were subpoenaed.
Senator Hawley,
You
your
were
time
the
has
target of an
expired.
investigation.
Do you have a question?
You were the target of an investigation. You lied to this committee. Why?
Senator, I never received a target letter. I'm curious, I understand why this committee jumped over 30 years of my career in considering my nomination and went to a salacious moment from graduate school where I tried to protect people. What I don't understand is why we're not looking at the last 3.5 years now.
Here's why.
Senator
It's because people are killed in these kind of incidents. It is an act of
Your
terrorism.
time is expired.
A special agent in charge found that you were involved. You lied to this committee in saying that you were never investigated.
Senator
you were never
Hawley.
the target of investigation. In fact, you were.
Your
You
time
lied to us
is
blatantly.
expired.
And you know it.
Senator Daines.